Did you know that there's actually a mafia organization in the United States? You probably think it's just some made-up thing for movies and TV shows, but it's actually not. It's real. And there are even members of the Mafia living among us to this day. They're dangerous people who don't hesitate to commit acts of violence. So let's take a look at the most shocking story about a member of the Mafia who survived a hit and continued smoking his cigarette.
Ow.
The men of the Genovese crime family have been running the streets of New York City since the 1930s. They've been involved in illegal activities like gambling, loan sharking, and narcotics trafficking. But they didn't just stop there. They spread their tentacles into other areas such as labor, racketeering, extortion, robbery, murder, and much more. The Genovese family became so powerful that they were able to control many aspects of society from politics to business. Everyone knew who they were and what they were capable of. And if you crossed them, you were likely to meet an early grave. In 1957, the family was shaken by the murder of one of its own, a man known only as Joe. Joe was a capo regime in the family and had been involved in some of their most lucrative schemes over the years. But he had also been caught in the crossfire of a gang war between the Genovese family and the Colombo family. The situation became so bad that even the police were afraid to go near him, and when they finally did, it was too late. He had already been taken out by his enemies. But what happened next was something nobody could have predicted. Despite being dead, Joe still had a lit cigarette dangling from his lips. It was not until the police arrived that they noticed the small flame at the end of the cigarette burning away. People were stunned and confused as to how a dead man could still be smoking a cigarette. Some even said it was a miracle, but there was a logical explanation behind this bizarre occurrence. It all had to do with the way Joe had been killed. He had been shot in the head, which had caused the brain to swell and push against the skin. This created enough pressure to keep the mouth open, allowing the cigarette to remain in place. If you've ever seen someone get shot in the head, you may have noticed that their mouth often stays open, which is exactly what happened here. However, it's important to note that, although this may seem like an urban legend or a horror movie trope, it can happen in real life. In fact, there are many cases of people surviving gunshot wounds to the head and living normal lives afterwards. Of course, this is not common, and most people who are shot in the head do not survive. However, it is possible and should not be dismissed as just a myth or a tall tale. Joe's case is one of the most famous examples of this phenomenon and has been the subject of much discussion and debate. But no matter how you slice it, it's still a crazy story about a mafia boss who died but kept on smoking. Anthony "Tough Tony" Salerno was one of the most feared mobsters in America. He was known for his ruthless attitude and violent temper. His nickname, Tough Tony, was given to him because he was unafraid to get his hands dirty and do whatever it took to get the job done. This included beating up informants, intimidating witnesses, and even killing people who got in his way. However, Tony wasn't just a brute. He was also a shrewd businessman who knew how to make money. He ran a successful gambling operation that brought in millions of dollars every year. He also had a close relationship with several politicians who helped him get what he wanted. But despite all his power and money, Tony's luck eventually ran out. In 1986, he was arrested on racketeering charges and sentenced to 100 years in prison. This was a major blow to the Genovese family, as Tony was one of their most valuable members. He appealed the verdict, but his efforts were in vain. He was sent to the infamous Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, where he would spend the rest of his life. At first, Tony tried to maintain his tough guy image in prison, but it wasn't easy. He had to share a cell with another inmate and follow the same rules as everyone else. This was a far cry from the luxury lifestyle he was used to. Tony was determined to make the best of the situation. He started working in the prison library and eventually became friends with several of the guards. He also found a new hobby in playing chess. However, Tony's efforts to reform were short-lived. In 1992, he was caught smuggling drugs into the prison and was sent to solitary confinement. This was a major setback for Tony, but he was determined to make a comeback. He began attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and made amends with some of the people he had wronged in the past. He even started writing poetry, which he sent to friends on the outside. But Tony's efforts to turn over a new leaf were not enough to save him. In 1994, he suffered a fatal heart attack in his cell. He was found slumped over his chessboard, still holding a piece in his hand. The prison guards tried to revive him, but there was nothing they could do. Anthony Salerno, the feared mobster, was dead.
Ow.
Despite his violent reputation, Tony's friends and family mourned his death. They remembered him as a kind and generous man who was always willing to help those in need. They also remembered his sense of humor and his love of life. After his death, Tony's body was returned to his family, who held a private funeral for him. He was buried in a cemetery in New Jersey, where he rests in peace. Despite his criminal activities, Anthony Salerno was a complex and fascinating individual. He was a man who lived by his own rules and was never afraid to speak his mind. He was also a man who was capable of great violence, but who could also be kind and generous. In the end, he was a man who tried to make the best of a bad situation, even when he was facing his own mortality. Now, you might be wondering why a mafia boss like Anthony Salerno would be in prison in the first place. Well, it all has to do with the RICO Act, which stands for Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations. It was created in the 1970s to combat organized crime. The law allowed prosecutors to charge mobsters with a single criminal offense: conspiracy, rather than trying to prosecute them for each individual crime they committed. This meant that mobsters could no longer evade justice by cooperating with the government and turning on their fellow mobsters. One of the first people to be hit with the RICO Act was Anthony Salerno. He was charged with running a criminal enterprise that engaged in a pattern of racketeering activity. This included extortion, bribery, gambling, and drug trafficking. Salerno was found guilty and sentenced to 100 years in prison. This was a major blow to the Mafia and sent a message to other mobsters that they could unhide behind their fancy suits and silk ties forever. Over the years, hundreds of mobsters have been prosecuted under the RICO. Many of them have been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The law has been a powerful tool in the fight against organized crime, but it hasn't been without its critics. Some argue that it's too broad and vague and that it allows prosecutors to target anyone they want. However, the RICO Act remains in place and continues to be used to prosecute mobsters and other criminals. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to watch another video about a man who was shot but still walked 2 miles. Thank you for watching.